Discover the Iceman's curse, the 5,000-year-old frozen mummy whose discoverers seem to die one by one in the years that follow.
Chapter 1: A Whisper in the Ice.
It was September 19th, 1991. The sun over the Ötzi Alps shone with that special autumn gentleness that deceives tourists. The warm color of gold on the rock ridges, the blue of the sky so pure it was unreal. Helmuta Simona and his wife Erika were returning from the summit of Finalspitze, descending the narrow path through the Similauns glacier. They had a beautiful day behind them. Their legs were a bit tired, and in their eyes there was peace, in the eyes of people who found a moment of respite from everyday life. It was one of those moments when you think the world is simple and predictable, that he knows what awaits him around the next corner. Helmut was leading the way, focused on the slippery surface, when his eyes landed on something dark, half a meter below the line of melting snow. He didn't immediately understand what he was seeing. Human neck, dark, wrinkled skin, the back of the head with remnants of hair. Someone was lying face down, as if he had fallen asleep in the most inappropriate place on the earth.
The first thought was prosaic, a mountaineer who was not so lucky. Helmut shouted to his wife, and they carefully descended to the edge of the rock niche where the glacier formed a natural depression. They approached slowly. The body was partially submerged in the remains of icy water and ice, which was melting extremely quickly in this hot summer. The head, shoulders, and upper back were visible. The skin, where it was exposed, was the color of dark parchment, dry and taut as a drum. No modern clothes, no climbing equipment like any responsible hiker would carry. Erika felt something tighten in her stomach. It wasn't an unfortunate accident from a few weeks ago. This death was different. Old, so old that the air around her seemed to have a different consistency, a different weight. Helmut took out his camera, he always carried one, and took a few photos. Little did he know that these photographs would become some of the most important archaeological documents of the 20th century.
The next hours were chaos. Mountain rescuers were called, then the police, then scientists. Each new arrival looked at the body with a mixture of curiosity and dismay. The first extraction attempts turned out to be bizarre. Rescuers used pneumatic hammers and ice axes, ruthlessly breaking the ice around the body. Someone tried to pull the mummy's hand out until one of the stiff limbs broke. No one had yet realized that he was handling an artifact from over 5,000 years ago with the same gentleness with which he would dig a car out of the snow. Only when a bow with arrows, an axe with a copper blade, and a backpack made of bark were found next to the body, a word appeared in the air that changed everything. Prehistory. It wasn't a missing hiker. This was a Copper Age man who, for some reason, never returned home. And now, after 5,300 years, the glacier has returned it to the world.
He was named Ötzi, after the Ötzi Alps in which he rested. The media immediately went crazy. The headlines screamed about a miracle, a window into the past, a man who had lived for 5,000 years.
Photos of the dark, shrunken figure circulated around the world. Scientists were talking about the opportunity of the century. Such a perfectly preserved mummy from the Copper Age was unprecedented. Analysis after analysis revealed further details. He was about 45 years old at the time of his death, suffered from arthritis and atherosclerosis, had holes in his teeth, and wore layered clothes made of various leathers and grasses. He was someone, not a symbol, not an artifact, but a real man who went to the mountains one day and never came back. There was something deeply disturbing about this, because when it was extracted from the ice, massacred by pneumatic drills, transported in buckets to the summit, no one thought it might be more than just science. No one asked if the glacier returned it voluntarily, or maybe Ötzi himself decided when it was time to return.
Erika Simon later recalled that when she first saw Ötzi's face, before he was covered, before he was cordoned off and secured, she felt something difficult to describe. Not fear, not disgust, something closer to recognition, as if this face, although mummified and distorted by the centuries, was watching, as if she knew. Of course, it was stupid, she said later. It was just the dead face of a dead man. But the memory remained, and it came back many years later when it began to matter how many of those who had come into contact with Ötzi that day and in the months that followed were now dead. The Simalaun Glacier lies on the border between Austria and Italy at an altitude of over 3,000 meters. It is a raw, beautiful, and unforgiving place. It was a trade route in the Copper Age. Ötzi probably followed it with some purpose that history has swallowed up with him. Maybe he was coming home. Maybe he was running away. Maybe he was going for the last time to encounter something that couldn't be escaped. Now he was walking again, but in a new direction, and no one knew yet what price others would pay for it. The news of the gruesome discovery, hastily relayed by the shocked Simons after descending to the nearest Simalaun shelter, set in motion an irreversible chain of events that forever changed the face of modern archaeology. Although the beginnings of the operation were marked by shocking ignorance, lack of professionalism, and a complete disregard for scientific procedures. When, after several days of delay and terrible weather conditions, representatives of local authorities, Austrian gendarmes, and mountain rescuers finally arrived at the site, none of them had the slightest idea that they were facing one of the most important and oldest discoveries in the entire history of mankind. They treated the body trapped in the ice as just another routine and somewhat irritating criminal case or a typical mountain accident, focusing solely on removing the problem from the tourist area as quickly and as little as possible, not realizing the irreversible damage they would soon cause to this unique time capsule. A chaotic makeshift mining operation began, which in retrospect, and from the point of view of modern science, appears as an act of absolute barbarism and gross desecration, a merciless clash of mindless technology with the fragile, priceless heritage of the Copper Age. The rescuers, disregarding the delicacy of the find and ignoring the basic rules of caution, used heavy, brutal tools, including mountain ice axes, ski poles, and even a heavy pneumatic hammer powered by a combustion compressor, borrowed in a hurry from a nearby shelter. Their goal was simply to carve the frozen, hard-frozen body out of its icy prison, where it had lain completely intact for long millennia, and the whole scene resembled the gruesome and hasty work of butchers rather than careful, methodical, and respectful archaeological research.
Each powerful blow of the steel blade, each brutal, vibrating shock of the pneumatic drill tore apart not only the ancient ice, but also the priceless artifacts and the very remains of the ancient wanderer, whose left thigh and buttocks were severely, irreparably damaged during this primitive and disrespectful exhumation. There was a specific, sickly smell of melting old ice, rusty equipment, compressor exhaust, and something else, the elusive, archaic aroma of preserved flesh that seemed to be released from the breaking frost like the rotten breath of antiquity, muffled by the roar of a modern engine.
None of the onlookers and supposed professionals present paid the slightest attention to the historical context of the find. Priceless objects that could tell the extraordinary story of the life, struggle, and death of the man, later called Ötzi, were treated with surprising, ignorant nonchalance, forcibly removed from the ice, broken, and even unceremoniously thrown onto the pile of mud next to the body. A unique 2-meter-long yew wood bow was broken, a delicate alpine grass cloak was damaged and torn, and a quiver full of finely crafted arrows was treated like worthless garbage, while a random group of climbers looked on at this grim spectacle, taking souvenir photos with joyful smiles, transforming the act of desecration into a cheap tourist attraction. When this battered body, damaged by heavy equipment, was finally, after many tedious attempts, completely freed from the shackles of ice, its unnaturally stiff, dried limbs were a grotesque and tragic sight, reminding us of the frailty of the human condition in the face of the merciless passage of time. Instead of treating the remains with proper reverence, rescuers tried to force the stiff mummy into a standard plastic body bag using physical violence, breaking the bones in the process, and then brutally stuffed it into a makeshift, inappropriately sized wooden transport coffin. This act of brutality was the final, most blatant humiliation for the ancient glacier lord, completely reducing him to the status of a problematic criminal cargo that must be transported as quickly as possible down the valley, away from the majesty of the mighty mountains that for centuries had been his only home, battlefield, and eternal, inviolable resting place.
The rescue helicopter, spinning with a deafening, inhuman roar that brutally shattered the silence of the mountain, carried the wooden box containing the body into the air, finally and irrevocably tearing Ötzi away from his cold, icy sanctuary, thus sealing the end of his 5,000-year slumber and the beginning of his new, grim existence in the sterile laboratories of the modern world. The machine moved hurriedly towards civilization, leaving behind it a jagged, desecrated hole in the melting glacier, an empty depression that resembled a festering wound in the pristine body of a mountain from which something of fundamental importance had been torn away. As the helicopter disappeared behind the jagged skyline and the roar of its engines faded away, a sudden, unnatural, and incredibly heavy silence fell over the Ötztal Alps, deeper, stickier, and definitely more ominous than ever before, as if the mountains themselves had held their breath in silent protest against what had just happened.
This new silence had nothing of the peace of nature. It was a silence heavy with vibrating tension, a harbinger of an approaching storm and the dull echo of an ancient curse that, according to local beliefs, befalls anyone who dares to rob the dead. The glacier, brutally stripped of its greatest and most closely guarded secret, now seemed to emanate a cold, vindictive aura that slowly, invisibly seeped towards the inhabited valleys, carrying with it an elusive sense of impending doom. The first chapter of this story was irreversibly written in a mixture of ancient blood and melting ice, and the callous, brutal tearing of the mummy from its sacred zone and forcing it into the world of the profane triggered an invisible, psychological avalanche of tragic, inexplicable events, blurring the fragile line between the triumph of modern science and the primal, atavistic fear of powerful forces that should certainly have remained in eternal sleep.
Chapter 2. The Pathologist's Touch.
Rainer Henn was 64 years old and had spent his entire life in the company of the dead. As the head of the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Innsbruck, he was a man who saw everything: victims of accidents, crimes, disasters. Death was an everyday occurrence for him, not a mystery. When he was called to the Simalaun Glacier to catalogue a find, he came with the same professional calm with which he had come to any other call. He was cool, methodical, precise. Such is the pathologist who has lived decades in the profession, a man separated from death by a thick layer of procedure and scientific routine. When he leaned over Ötzi's mummified body and took it in his hands, with his bare hands, without gloves, because no one had yet thought about protocols in this context, he didn't feel anything special. Maybe just the coldness of skin that has been in ice for 5,000 years. Maybe that particular dryness that parchment has. Nothing more. He placed the body in the bag with the same professional neutrality as he would have done with the accident victim from a week ago. And yet something started.
Ötzi's discovery made Henn famous, at least in academic circles and in the regional media. He suddenly became one of the faces of this discovery, an expert quoted by journalists, a lecturer invited to conferences. He was proud of it, but in a subdued academic way. A man like him doesn't lose his mind because of fame. In the winter of 1992, a few months after the discovery, Henn was driving to a scientific conference in Innsbruck, where he was to deliver a paper about Ötzi. The road led along an alpine route he had ridden hundreds of times. He knew every turn. The conditions were, as they are in the Alps in winter, difficult but not exceptional. There is no official data on what exactly happened. All we know is that the car went off the road. Rainer Henn died on the spot. He was 64 years old, and he was going to tell the world about the man he touched with his own hands. He didn't arrive. It was an accident. Bad luck. One of thousands of tragic accidents that occur every year on alpine roads. Nothing more.
At least that's what they said back then. No one has connected the dots yet. Henn's death was recorded with real sadness in the academic community. He was a respected scientist. His departure was a loss for the Institute and for science. Obituaries were written and masses were held. Life went on because that's how life is. It runs after the death of others without stopping for ceremonies. Ötzi was already lying in a special chamber in Innsbruck where scientists were working on his analysis. DNA samples were taken. The contents of his intestines were examined. Every inch of his body and every artifact found on him was analyzed. None of those who worked non-stop on the mummy thought about Henn. Nobody drew a table with names and dates of death. Not yet. That moment would come later when the list became long enough that it would take an active effort to ignore it. The first death was like the first drop of rain before a storm, a single one easy to ignore, not a sign of what was to come.
There is something in this image that returns to the imagination. Rainer Henn, a serious man of science, bending over a 5,000-year-old body and taking it in his hands, without gloves. No distance, direct human contact. Warm, living hands cupping the skin of someone who lived and breathed in the era when Stonehenge was still being built. In pathology, it is sometimes said that bodies teach doctors humility, that working with death changes a person, opens something inside him that cannot be closed. Maybe Henn had been a pathologist too long to believe in such things.
Maybe he was too rational, too armored by decades of profession to feel anything in that touch. Or maybe that was his mistake, that he didn't feel anything, that he treated Ötzi as just another corpse, another case to catalogue, when Ötzi was no one's case. He was someone. And maybe, if you believe the things that rational people of science shouldn't believe, he remembered every hand that touched him.
The bare, defenseless hand of the eminent pathologist hung for one short, infinite fraction of a second in the terribly cold air over the left, damaged arm of the nameless Ötzi, and at that moment the silence filling the great hall became deafening to the senses. Then, very slowly, with a distinct though desperately and carefully hidden from itself microscopic tremor, it fell softly onto the incredibly hard, thoroughly mummified skin of the ice victim. This one brief touch, this seemingly completely banal, meaningless moment of physical, even intimate contact between a highly educated, vibrant modern man and the hostile, frozen-in-time embodiment of ancient death was fraught with devastating consequences. The sensation was exactly like accidentally touching an exposed deadly wire under extremely high voltage, with the only subtle difference that instead of a brutal electric current, something incomparably more archaic entered Dr. Hen's body, weakened by weariness. The uneven surface of the Iceman's body was unnaturally rough to the direct touch, hard as carved stone, and incredibly, terrifyingly cold, emanating around a pulsating cold that certainly did not come from hospital cold rooms and generators. Rather, it seemed that this frost was being transported directly from the very black heart of the ancient, merciless glacier, a cold that penetrated deeply and mercilessly under the bewildered doctor's thin skin, insidiously entering his bloodstream, and from there straight into his bones. Hen carefully ran his fingertips over the withered arm of the silent mummy, systematically examining the texture of hard muscles and tendons taut like strings, tangibly, bodily feeling the terrible history of brutal suffering and pain beneath his fingertips. With the terrifying hindsight of time, this irrational and defenseless gesture, devoid of logical explanation, seems to be the most eloquent, even bright and fully symbolic seal of a dark pact with ancient death, signed not with ink, but with a naked human touch. The silent, seemingly harmless permission for a patient, ancient curse which had been so violently and devastatingly awoken from eons of cold lethargy by the ruthless mechanical intrusion of a heartless modern world to pass unchallenged onto its docile victim. The doctor then felt a strange, extremely disturbing, icy tingling rapidly traveling up the base of his neck, a fleeting, icy thrill of fully irrational, animal fear, which he immediately, with ruthless force of will, suppressed with his rationalizing mind versed in the arcana of medicine.
The next tragic step on this doomed path, a step that once again broke and completely trampled on fundamental protocols and tightened the dark bond, was the transfer of the damaged corpses directly to a specialized, durable bag for human bodies. This absolutely standard procedure was intended to protect the fragile mummy against further inevitable biological degradation and to perfectly prepare it for the upcoming, even more advanced, complicated imaging tests or expensive genetic tests planned at universities, and again with astonishing thoughtlessness, completely ignoring the absolutely elementary, indisputable principles that he himself had been instilling with pedantic fury into his students who were staring at him for so many years, the doctor decided to take a risk. Having ruthlessly ignored the protests of his inner scientific consciousness, Hen, with complete and unjustified premeditation, decided to personally perform this mechanical, routine operation with his own completely bare and defenseless hands. Such an act at such an early stage of research in a highly formalized and rule-ridden medical environment was a complete, scandalous, and completely inexcusable occurrence that could easily have resulted
in his sudden dismissal from the profession. Hen wrapped his bare hands around the extremely fragile, even frighteningly and unnaturally light body of the legendary Ötzi, clearly feeling under his fingertips every dried hardness, every clear outline of ancient ribs under the collapsed skin. With infinite, incredible caution, he slowly carried them into space, landing at the bottom of the dark interior of a black, tear-resistant synthetic transport bag, previously prepared by his terrified assistants while maintaining all sterility standards. His strange, even surreal gesture on the part of the doctor was reminiscent of a very specific, macabre embrace in which the titled pathologist and his brilliant discovery were united bodily for one very short, infinite in its meaning moment. They created such a fascinating, strange sculpture woven inseparably from a warm organism vibrating with life and ancient death, frozen for eternity in ice, lit ruthlessly from above by the bright, shadowless fluorescent lamps of a cold medical laboratory. As he laboriously inserted the extremely hard mummy into the black plastic, the cool sweat that poured over him heralded a strange, recurring feeling that this ancient, battered body was, in some ineffable way, completely hostile and alien to scientific knowledge, and at the same time, strangely enough, it was absurdly and highly disturbingly close to the touch, as if its macabre bark and bone-dry exterior hid a dull, mocking, and soundless warning of inevitable punishment. The smooth, energetic closing of the long zipper of the bag, resulting in a sharp, mechanical sound that penetrates deep into the brain and brutally and loudly breaks the perfect silence, acted almost like the dry crack of a final and irreversible death sentence. With terrifying clarity, this phenomenon sounded like a final, never-to-be-undone, dull slam of the heavy lid of a lead coffin, cutting off antiquity from the greedy gaze of medical equipment. However, it quickly turned out that it was not the unfortunate Iceman who was finally enslaved there forever, but a noose was silently and inexorably placed around the doctor's neck.
Since the moment of this groundbreaking research for the world, whole weeks of painstaking work have passed, filled with incredibly intense, almost every moment consuming analyses, painstaking observations, and constant, insistent mass interest of the world's most important press media and television stations. These unforeseen circumstances instantly, in the blink of an eye, catapulted the busy Dr. Rainer Hen to the brilliant spotlight-lit pinnacles of global science, making his balanced judgments a key reference point in all global discussions among the university's science elites. A huge antique desk made of dark oak was constantly bending, day and night, under the rapidly growing, almost exorbitant weight of meticulous personal notes, thousands of sheets of paper, innovative results of expensive tomographic analyses, and specialized tests of radioactive isotopes. Hen was preparing under great and extraordinary nervous tension for the most important public speech in the history of his entire wonderful and extremely orderly medical, judicial, and academic career, which was to be the diamond in the crown of his priceless biography. He definitely intended to solemnly, in the glow of luxurious spotlights, proudly deliver the main, thrilling, and mind-opening outstanding lecture during the rapidly approaching wonderful, prestigious, and large international conference gathering countless crowds, accompanied by thousands of curious pairs of research eyes. Without a shadow of hesitation or any fear of criticism, he decided to openly present his completely groundbreaking, absolutely unprecedented discoveries in every possible respect, excluding errors and describing in great detail all the alleged causes of centuries of agony and the disastrous condition of the exploited prehistoric organism. It was undoubtedly an unprecedented time of overwhelming euphoria at the university, sprinkled with the embrace of respected authorities and the envy of numerous silent competitors. At the same time, the researcher had to face the crushing, terrible depriving of valuable and regenerating dreams pressure of the academic community, which raised the blood pressure of the slowly aging doctor. Sitting alone, completely still, in his own spacious, comfortable office, flooded with the warm glow of a traditional lamp at the university, he often unconsciously, driven by a force invisible to the surroundings, slowly wandered his thoughts back exactly to the memorable and ominous fraction of a dark second,
Until that specific moment in the mortuary when, with trembling hands and for the first time so consciously and carelessly, he touched the hard skin of a mummified and disturbing object from the old ice ages. Quite suddenly, he noticed after some time that his still completely naked, functional, and so useful right human hand began to vibrate unpleasantly, slightly, completely independently of the conscious nervous commands of the nervous system, in an absurdly persistent way, while holding the expensive fountain pen from the university. He was, however, unshakably convinced in his own erroneous judgments of the great and undeniable triumph of knowledge, failing to see the darkness of growing terror over himself.
Finally, and very unexpectedly, the cold, dark autumn, long-awaited, memorable, frosty day of the long and carefully planned conference in the glare of the world's media finally arrived. A foggy and incredibly windy, frosty morning sprinkled with pouring heavy rain settling on the dirty window pane in the morning. Heavy, dark blue piles of large rain clouds very dangerously, in a way that heralded severe lightning discharges, hung extremely low with a leaden cloak directly above the snow-covered and extremely beautiful steep alpine majestic peaks on the way. This menacing sight, incredibly disturbing, like an old Gothic landscape in gloomy romantic paintings in the castle, gave the surrounding and widely known charming mountain landscape a painfully malicious, terribly harsh, and extremely depressing character. Unfazed by such nonsense and mundane difficulties, Hen slowly but surely packed his heavy leather company black briefcases tightly packed with dozens of detailed, important documents from a research institute and an academic hospital invaluable to world science into the large trunk of a luxurious, expensive passenger car in the morning. Then, fully confident in the excellent driving characteristics of his wonderful German machine, the engine with a sensational drive equipped for comfort immediately set off smoothly and uncompromisingly on a slow and very tiring route through murderously winding, breathtakingly narrow and slippery mountain steep high alpine passes. The safe interior of a heated, comfortable, shiny car suddenly appeared like a small rocket, an incredibly isolated and wonderfully warm, armored, safe, private, sterile capsule rushing quickly ahead with its tires through the hostile and hatefully howling with cold, terrible, completely depopulated world of wild, powerful, cruel death to the human howl of nature. In some critical hindsight fraction of a long, tiring, fatal, wet, tricky, slippery traveling second, driving and crashing into a foggy, absolutely dark, known to all as dangerous, deadly, terrible wide bend at great altitude. The thick, murderous, milky wall of alpine sticky fog suddenly completely, like a heavy steel curtain thrown on the stage, dramatically blocked any further path, limiting visibility completely. Suddenly, a second vector suddenly appeared in front of the scientist, blindly rushing along an erratic, slippery, and busy road, and with an incredibly terrifying, stunning, suicidal, almost suicidal speed, a large, steel, deadly, heavy-duty attack vehicle, roaring menacingly on the wet asphalt in the thicket, roaring menacingly. In the mind of the unfortunate, brilliant, experienced, rational doctor-scientist, instantly and on the margin, a fraction of a nanosecond of the dark as hell and terribly painful consciousness erupted with indescribable fear, time suspended, and completely, absolutely without mercy stopped flowing objectively for the victim's consciousness, stopping the nightmare in the victim's head. Then the doctor clearly saw a fraction of the lens of the terrible reflection of terror in the second driver driving towards the final collision and crushing death with luxury metal, tearing out the insides.
The gruesome physics of the event occurred in a fraction of a moment, completely exploding, incredibly bloody great, and final terrible bone-crushing, loud, murderous, and absolutely certain death, ending the story of a fraction of a life. The moment of the deadly loud collision became one all-encompassing split-second explosion of pure, terrible, immeasurably powerful momentum, violently crossing the shiny and twisted car bodies, massacring the human slender internal organs weakened by minor collisions, brutally interrupting breathing, destroying bones, and silencing the blood in the heart. Time.
Chapter 3. The Mountains Take Their Toll.
Kurt Fritz was the kind of mountaineer who was written about in climbing textbooks, not as a warning, but as a role model. He knew the Ötztal Alps better than the back of his hand, having led tours through some of their most challenging routes for 20 years, and in that time never lost a single client. His confidence in the mountains was proverbial. His friends from the shelters said that Kurt could read the weather like a musician, that he knew when the mountain wanted you to leave and when it was telling you to turn back. He was the only man in the area who, without hesitation, led Rainer Henn's team over the peak to the Similaun Glacier, a glacier that is treacherous in winter even for experienced guides. Fritz led the way with that characteristic grace of an advanced climber, confidently, economically, with a minimum of effort on each step. When they arrived and Fritz saw Ötzi, he looked at him the same way Henn did later, with professional, cold interest. He did his job, took home his salary, and everything seemed to end well.
The avalanche that killed Kurt Fritz was later described by witnesses as sudden and unexpected, the kind that only happens to the most experienced. The thing about the mountains is that really good conditions can turn deadly in minutes, and no amount of years of experience can provide complete protection against this. The avalanche fell exactly where Fritz was leading the group, in the same region of the Ötztal Alps, near the Similaun Glacier, in the same terrain he knew better than anyone else. His body was later found deep under the snow. He didn't suffer for long. Such avalanches rarely give time to suffer. But the irony of this death was so thick that you could suffocate in it. A mountain master, killed by the mountains, which he trusted so much that he himself became their victim. The man who led others to discover someone buried by the same peaks thousands of years earlier. As if something in these mountains had memory and scores to settle. In local shelters and among mountain guides, the silence after Fritz's death was different than the silence after an ordinary tragedy. Guides talk about accidents. It's part of mountain culture, a way of processing risk that's built into their profession. But when anyone talked about Fritz's death, a different kind of cold flowed through the room than the one outside. Not everyone dared to say it directly, but many thought the same thing. Henn, then Fritz, both in Ötztal, both connected with the discovery. 2 people dead a year after the glacier opened its secret. Maybe it was just a series of painful coincidences. They happen. Maybe the mountains are just dangerous and life is fragile. But when you're sitting in a mountain shelter with the wind roaring outside the window and counting the names, the numbers start to speak their own language, a language for which statistics has no answer. Kurt Fritz left his ice axes stuck in the shelter wall, a tradition when a guide passes away. No one took them off for a long time.
It struck exactly where Kurt Fritz was, and in the exact split second, avoiding the rest of the climbers, as if it was guided by some dark, invisible intelligence that was intended to eliminate only this one specific man. This terrifying irony of fate, this unnatural direction of the element, caused rational explanations to burst at the seams, giving way to the belief, returning like a boomerang, that it was not a coincidence, that the mountains, following the silent order of the Iceman, were claiming the one who had betrayed their oldest secret. In the center of this ruined landscape, where the powerful forces had finally come to a halt, was Fritz's lone ice axe, embedded deep in the compressed concrete snow, the only surviving artifact that had withstood the fury of the element. This lonely ice axe, illuminated by the pale, harsh sun breaking through the dark clouds, casting a long, terrifying shadow across the ruined surface, became a visual symbol of the final defeat of human pride against the merciless power of the ancient peaks. It looked like a ghastly tombstone erected by nature itself, a macabre reminder that no matter how much man believes himself to be the master of creation, in the end, the mountains always take what they claim as theirs. The death of Fritz, a seasoned veteran killed in an area he knew like the back of his hand by a phenomenon seemingly impossible to predict in those conditions, electrified the world and forever changed the narrative surrounding Ötzi's curse. What was previously treated as a media sensation, a catchy topic for tabloids preying on people's fascination with Dr. Hen's death, now took on the weight of a real, tangible, and deadly threat that no one dared to discuss in a disrespectful way. People directly involved in the research project, scientists in sterile laboratories, and guides leading subsequent trips to the glacier, began to look at the majestic snow-capped peaks not with their previous awe-filled admiration, but with growing, paralyzing fear. The Alps are no longer a beautiful background for tourist trips. They had become a vast, active trap, a mute, vengeful deity that had been awakened from its thousand-year slumber and now punished with iron consequence anyone who contributed to the desecration of his icy reliquary. With each passing day since Fritz's tragic death, the weight of this awareness settled in the researchers' minds like toxic dust, causing insomnia, anxiety attacks, and obsessive analysis of every coincidence, every slip, and every weather anomaly. The sense of security provided by modern technologies, helicopters, precise forecasts, advanced equipment, evaporated in the collision with a primitive, brutal, and selective force that could strike with the precision of a sniper using thousands of tons of frozen water. A story of Kurt Fritz, a master who was consumed by what he loved and what he supposedly completely controlled, became a dark memento, proof that in a world where science meets the ancient forces of nature, human knowledge is just an illusion, a protective cordon made of thin, cracking ice. Ötzi's curse finally shed the mask of urban legend, evolving into a state of permanent psychological terror. It became a predator that did not have to come out of the shadows, because the very shadows, the very frost, and the very air around the Ötztal Massif became an extension of its inexorable will.
Chapter 4. Death of the Watcher.
Rainer Holzel did not touch the body. He wasn't walking on a glacier. He did not examine, did not touch, did not order the exhumation. He was standing a few meters away with a camera at his eye, filming. He was a television journalist. The tool of his profession was the lens glass, not the human hand. If Ötzi's curse was based on touch, on physical contact with something that should not be touched, then Holzel should be safe. Observer, witness, someone on the other side of the glass. His footage of Ötzi's discovery, the only surviving recording of the entire mining operation, has become a historic document. It was broadcast by television stations all over Europe. Thanks to him, Holzel became recognizable, quoted, and awarded. Through the lens of his camera, he observed the moment that changed the history of archaeology. And maybe that was the problem, because if Ötzi's curse did not apply only to touch, but to anyone who came close to the secret, who looked too long, who saw too much, then Holzel saw everything, every detail, every part of the process. Through the camera lens, he recorded what was perhaps supposed to be forgotten.
The diagnosis came a few months after he finished documenting the discovery. Malignant brain tumor, one of the most difficult to treat, one of those that attacks quickly and without warning. In 1991 and 1992, medicine had much fewer options than today. Ötzi fought back, but the fight didn't last long. He died a few months after his camera recorded the recovery of a 5,000-year-old body. To the doctors, it was just another case of malignancy, a disease that strikes humans regardless of their connection to ancient mummies. For those who have already started counting, the third victim. The third person directly linked to Ötzi's discovery, who died shortly after that August day in 1991. Hen, car accident. Fritz, avalanche. Ötzi, brain tumor. 3 deaths, 3 different causes, 3 different paths to the same place. As if the curse was flexible, creative, adapting means to available tools. As if she didn't need one brilliant mechanism, she had time and infinite patience.
The final shot in Ötzi's footage shows Ötzi's face from an unusual close-up. The camera was shaking, as if the operator realized he was recording something he shouldn't have. The dark, shrunken face, the empty eye sockets, that strange pose of repose, the man lying as if he had simply laid down and closed his eyes. Ötzi had to stand very close to capture this shot. He had to look through the lens at that face for long seconds before he pressed the record button. What did he see? What did he feel as he looked through the glass at something that had been staring back for 5,000 years? We don't know that. Ötzi left no written memories of that day. His camera captured images, but not feelings. We only know that a few months later he was lying in a hospital bed with a brain tumor, and that he never had time to make another such important documentary. The tumor attacks the brain, the organ that sees, interprets, and processes images. Coincidence? Surely. But the human brain is designed to look for patterns, and that pattern spoke loudly, louder and louder. Watch out for Ötzi.
Chapter 5. Echo of the Iceman. 13 years had passed. Helmuta Simona, a pensioner from Nuremberg, still remembered every detail of that September day in 1991. He remembered the coolness of the air, the color of the sky, the soft voice of his wife when she called him to her. He remembered a dark shape in the ice and a strange feeling as if the earth had stopped moving. Ötzi's discovery was the central event of his life, the thing you talk about when someone asks what man has done with his existence. Helmut talked about him at meetings, over dinner, and in interviews. He became the face of discovery from the point of view of an ordinary person, not a scientist, not an expert, but a retired spouse who looked in the right place at the right moment. In 2004, on the 13th anniversary of the discovery, Helmut decided to return. There was something natural and inevitable about it, like a pilgrimage to a place where something important happened. He said goodbye to his wife at the hotel, took his equipment, and set out alone on a route he knew as well as he did. The weather looked good. Autumn in the Alps, cold and gold, the same blue sky, exactly the same as back then.
The storm came out of nowhere, the kind of alpine blizzard that can appear within half an hour, even on a cloudless morning, a cold front from the north that strikes the ridges and turns a golden autumn afternoon into white, blinding chaos. Helmut was an experienced walker. He knew the vagaries of the alpine weather, and he had the appropriate equipment with him. He was not an amateur. Yet. My wife was waiting at the hotel. When he didn't return by evening, she alerted rescuers. The search lasted 8 days. 8 days of rain, snow, and alpine teams searching the terrain meter by meter, while Erika Simon sat in the hotel, listening to her own breathing. They found him on the 10th day after he disappeared. He was lying in a mountain stream, frozen in ice, in the same position, face down, arms at his sides, legs slightly bent, as Ötzi had lain when Helmut found him 13 years earlier. The accident repeated itself, not only in the place, but also in the pose, as if history wanted to close itself into a perfect circle.
When rescuers published photos of Simon's found body and journalists compared them with photos from 1991, that first shot of Ötzi in the ice, a chill ran through the media that was hard to downplay even for the most skeptical. It wasn't just that the discoverer died in the same place as the discoverer. It was about that detail, the pose, a precise, almost painstakingly recreated pose, as if the mountain knew the original and decided to replicate it with a precision that was beyond chance. Psychiatrists and psychologists have talked about confirmation bias, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. Statisticians talked about convergence without causality. Scientists remained silent or issued cautious statements, but Erika Simon didn't need scientists' opinions. She sat in the hotel, photo in hand, and remembered that feeling from 1991, that the face in the ice was staring back at her. Now she realized that maybe she was right.
Chapter 6. The Domino Effect.
Helmut Simon's funeral took place in solemn silence. Erika Simon accepted condolences with the kind of dignity that comes from deep, incurable grief. Future neighbors, friends, journalists, the same ones who had written about his discovery for years, were now writing about his end. There was talk of an unfortunate accident, of capricious alpine weather, of a man who loved the mountains and allowed himself to be captured by them. No one spoke aloud about Ötzi, although everyone thought so. Dieter Warnecke sat in the front row at the funeral. He was the head of the rescue team that found Simon's body. He held this position for many years, saw many mountain tragedies, and carried the burden of those who could not be saved in time. He was 45 years old, physically fit, in the prime of life for a man of his profession. Simon's funeral moved him. Everyone was moved. But there must have been something more going on with Warnecke, something no one has seen.
An hour after the end of Helmut Simon's funeral ceremony, Dieter Warnecke had a heart attack. He was 45 years old. He was in excellent physical condition. The heart attack was sudden and massive. He didn't live to see the evening. The 7th victim. It was a moment when even the hardest skeptics fell silent, not because they believed in the curse, but because the numbers were no longer convenient to ignore. 7 people associated with Ötzi's discovery. 7 deaths in 13 years. Various causes: car accident, avalanche, brain tumor, freezing, heart attack. No coherent causal pattern, no common disease, no obvious mechanism. And yet 7. Journalists started counting and publishing the lists. The internet, then commonplace, was filled with theories and speculations. The term Ötzi's curse has entered common circulation, used seriously by some and ironically by others, but used.
The list of those marked grew as someone began to dig deeper. Conrad Spindler, the chief archaeologist who studied Ötzi for years, died in 2005, a year after Simon, of multiple sclerosis. He was 66 years old. Helmut Zimmermann, a lawyer who was involved in the dispute over the ownership of the mummy between Austria and Italy, had a heart attack shortly after the trial. Tom Loy, the Australian scientist who tested the blood DNA on Ötzi's tools, died of a genetic blood disorder in 2005, a disease he had had since birth, but which struck just then. Each of these deaths had a rational explanation. Each one was a tragedy, not a mystery. But when put together, they created a picture that was increasingly difficult to put together into simple statistics. Scientists say that confirmation bias works like this. Once you see a pattern, it starts to appear everywhere. Maybe so. But maybe the pattern is really there, and it's us who have refused to look for too long.
Chapter 7. The Weight of 5,000 Years.
The Archaeological Museum of South Tyrol in Bolzano is a modern and professional place. Glass, steel, controlled lighting, soundproof exhibition rooms. Ötzi lies in a special cryogenic chamber maintained at a constant temperature of -6 degrees Celsius and 90% humidity, conditions that replicate his icy grave on the glacier. Every year, over 300,000 visitors look at it through a small tempered glass window. So many times this dark, shrunken face is seen, preserved in memory, photographed on phones. Scientists who work here talk about it with respect, but without mysticism. It is an invaluable object of scientific research that has taught us an incredible amount about the Copper Age, about diet, diseases, migrations, and the genetics of humanity from thousands of years ago. They talk about him as a patient, as a subject, as a case. They rarely talk about him as a person. But he was a person. He had a name we don't know. He had a family that we don't know. He had a life full of days and nights, successes and failures, loves and losses, a life as complex and full as our own, only compressed over the centuries into a few data points: age, gender, diet, DNA.
The tests that were carried out on Ötzi's body over 3 decades revealed a detail that changed the narrative in a fundamental way. Ötzi did not die in the mountains. Ötzi was murdered. X-rays taken years after the discovery revealed an arrowhead deeply embedded in his left arm, just near the axillary artery. The arrow entered from behind and below, an angle indicating an ambush. Ötzi did not see the attacker. He had no chance to defend himself. He survived the arrow for a time. Analysis of the wounds on his arms suggested he had been fighting someone shortly before his death, but the arrow ultimately killed him by bleeding or shock. Someone who knew him or was following him into the mountains waited for the right moment and fired. A murder from 5,300 years ago, perfectly preserved in ice. A murder victim, not an accident, not a disease, not the forces of nature. Someone deliberately ended his life. And if we attribute some moral meaning to the curse, some logic of justice or revenge, maybe this detail explains everything. A murdered man not resting in peace, demanding something he did not get during his life, truth and memory.
Rationalists have an answer to Ötzi's curse, and it is simple. People die. Those involved in Ötzi discovery were mostly middle-aged or older. Statistically, some of them must have died within the following years. Alpine accidents happen regularly. The mountains are dangerous for everyone, not just those associated with one mummy. Cancer and cardiovascular diseases kill every day, with no connection to archaeology. What we call a curse is actually a psychological and statistical phenomenon. We look for patterns because our brains are designed to do so. We see a face in stone, a story in a random event. We need Ötzi's curse because it says something that rationalism cannot say, that the past is alive, that our actions have consequences, that even 5,000 years cannot silence the scream of a murdered man. And maybe that's why, not against logic, but alongside it, the curse has not disappeared, because it answers questions that science has no answers to. What is due to the dead? What do we do with the silence that remains after them?
There is one place in the Bolzano Museum that every visitor returns to. A small, darkened room where you can see inside the cryogenic chamber through thick, cool glass. Inside, in the icy twilight, lies Ötzi. Dark, bastards, absolutely still. The face is turned slightly to the side. One eye, an empty, dark socket, is turned upwards towards the window, towards those who are watching. Thousands of people a day put their faces against the cold glass and look, and almost all of them later say the same thing, that they had the feeling that Ötzi was watching too, that this dark, silent face is more present, more alive than it should be. Of course, this is an illusion, pareidolia, our brains looking for faces and intentions where there are none, of course. But standing by this cold glass, in this dark chamber, with that Copper Age face on the other side, even the greatest rationalist feels something intangible saying in his ear, "I am here. Do you remember who brought me? Do you remember how many there are left? And I'm still here. And I'll be here long after you're gone, too."